want to remind folks that there's coffee and tea and water in the room to the rear. The restrooms are also to the rear. We are streaming this, so if you have friends who would have liked to be here but they couldn't, they can go onto the University Bahamas official Facebook page, and they can watch the proceedings. Also, we want to point out to you that the Organization for Responsible Governance has a booth outside on your left, where you can get information about voter registration. We certainly want to encourage our students. How many students? Raise your hand if you're a student of UB and you're in this room right now. Raise your hand. If you're a student, current student, Professor Davis, and raise your hand if you're registered to vote. Okay. All right. So we encourage you to register to vote. We encourage you. Yes, I. No, I never discouraged registration. I never discouraged voter registration. I support voter registration. Right. Give yourself the option. And all right, so we're gonna begin momentarily. Push is aggressive. It's aggressive. Also, want to just take a moment to express our appreciation and thanks to the Office of University Relations and the team there who have been making sure that we can record these proceedings and make them available to the general public.
All right, thank you.
I have the pleasure now of inviting Indira Martin to speak on the topic of the biomedical case for decolonization of the Bahamas. Sounds fascinating. Indira Martin is a Bahamian biomedical scientist with a strong interest in public health. She has a Bachelor of Science in Molecular Biology from the University of Edinburgh and a Cancer Research UK-funded doctorate in Biomedical Sciences from the University of Sheffield. As the current director of the National Reference Lab at the Bahamas Ministry of Health, she specializes in laboratory medicine with an emphasis on molecular testing for diseases of public health concern. Dr. Martin.
Thank you. Aggressive bush here. Okay. All right, good afternoon. First, I want to thank the organizers of this conference for providing the space for me to bring my biomedical case for decolonization of the Bahamas. Thanks to Dr. Strawn and team. So just by way of introduction, I am the director currently of the National Reference Lab. And so I've spent the last 14 years or so actually focused on detecting pathogens. So these are viruses, bacteria, and so on. But at the same time, I do have a background in cancer. So I would say that overall my interest is kind of the intersection between the molecular world and the molecular mechanisms of disease, and on the other hand, with the macro level of society and how these things impact human health in the Bahamas. So for this reason, I've always been haunted by this quote by Dr. Frantz Fanon, a great revolutionary thinker, originally from Martinique. And interestingly, Fanon was actually a psychiatrist. He was a trained clinician, a physician. and a revolutionary. So he had this interesting cross change between these two worlds that I am interested in. And in his quote, he says that imperialism leaves behind the germs of rot, which we must clinically detect and remove from our land, but from our minds as well. So here you see him using language that is clinical in nature. He's talking about germs. He's talking about clinically detecting, but he's also talking about the land and the mind and the interchange between these. Which brings me to my thesis statement. So my thesis statement is that colonialism and neocolonialism create psychosocial, environmental, and physiological conditions that are detrimental to the physical and mental health of diasporic Africans, particularly in the Bahamas. Therefore, I propose that decolonization can be implemented as a biomedical intervention to improve public health. First thing I want to start with is a statement of the problem. So the Bahamas is in a public health crisis. I don't think that there is much debate about that. We have one of the highest rates of many chronic diseases, including diabetes. I say diabesity, that's a combination. Diabetes, obesity, hypertension, breast and prostate cancer. We're in the top 20 globally for murder. A lot of interpersonal violence in the Bahamas. And we have a traditional diet that is high in fat, high in sugar, high salt, high in processed food, and low in fruit and vegetables. So this is killing us. We have our major cause of death in the Bahamas is basically circulatory disease, ischemic heart disease, stroke, hypertensive heart disease, and diabetes, but also interpersonal violence, infectious diseases like HIV, kidney diseases, and cancer, and so on. So that's what's killing us in the Bahamas, largely diseases of lifestyle, but also diseases of infectious diseases. What I want to talk about here is the pathways to which we find ourselves in this disease state in the Bahamas at the individual and collective level. So normally in the cell, there is a type of balance that is kept called redox homeostasis. What this is that there are reactive oxygen species, also known as free radicals in the cell. These are normally part of the cell signaling apparatus, as well as the immune system's ability to fight pathogens. And normally these reactive oxygen species are kept in check by antioxidants. And this balance is maintained and the cell is able to do what the cell does, and the body is happy. But what can happen is that there can be an imbalance leading to too many reactive oxygen species being in the cell. And what this does is it causes cell death and ultimately tissue death, which leads to all of the diseases that we know about, diabetes and hypertension and so on. So our problem in the Bahamas is that we have a lot of energy. We're taking in a lot of sources of energy, such as sugar and fats. And these are going through the mitochondria. The mitochondria is the cellular apparatus that metabolizes energy. So we're feeding all these sugar and fats into the mitochondria, and it's resulting in the overproduction of reactive oxygen species, which is throwing off the balance of the cell, such that we end up in the state that's called oxidative stress. Oxidative stress is a very bad place for a cell to be in, because these reactive oxygen species, they are like little fireballs in the cell. They are bouncing around the cell, they're knocking out the components of the cell and causing a state that leads to chronic inflammation in the tissue. And ultimately, as I said, this leads to cell tissue and organ damage, which is the prelude to chronic disease. How do we get here? So the first thing is we eat too many fats in the Bahamas, and this leads to a condition called lipotoxicity. Normally, our fat cells, the adipocytes, they store all of the fat. When we have a high-fat meal, the fat is nicely stored in these fat cells, the adipocytes. And so they are kept there until a time when we need the energy, and then these adipocytes release the fat cells into the bloodstream so that cells can use the fat for energy. But of course, when you have, if you're having a high-fat diet, a high-fat meal every day, you're getting these lipid globules in your bloodstream. The adipocytes eventually get to a point where they can't actually suck it up out of the bloodstream. They're beyond their storage. And at this point, they redeposit the fat back into the bloodstream, or it's not stored in the adipocytes. And so you end up with cells that don't have the capacity to store fat. Now they're subject to these big globs of fat that they can't metabolize. And what does that lead to? Again, our friend, oxidative stress, which again, reactive oxygen species that are bouncing around the cells and eventually causing the cell to die, messing up the membrane integrity of the cell and so on, and the cell dies. If you get enough cells dying, you eventually get organ damage in a particular cell. So this depends on which organ you're looking at. So if you're talking about heart disease, lipotoxicity can lead to, if you're talking about the heart, lipotoxicity can lead to cardiovascular disease. If you're talking about the pancreas, lipotoxicity can kill off the beta cells that secrete insulin for the body to metabolize sugars. And then you end up with diabetes and insulin resistance. If you're talking about the brain, lipotoxicity can lead to a stroke. So this is one of the key pathways by which chronic disease comes into being. Another way, glucotoxicity, gluco meaning sugar. So we have a very high sugar diet. We're taking in all the sugar. It's much too much for what the body is able to balance. And so again, the mitochondria, which is the kind of energy engine of the cell, is being pumped full of these sugars. And at first it's happy because it loves and it wants to make energy, but eventually it's overwhelmed. And again, we end up with reactive oxygen species, these fireballs that are killing off the cells and causing disease as they kill off bits of organs. Genotoxicity. Geno speaks to the genome, so we're talking about the genes. And this is described as damage to the cellular genetic material by a chemical or physical agent. For example, radiation, heavy metals, chemicals, and our good friend, reactive oxygen species. And again, these are agents that actually break up the DNA. And the problem with that is it leads to the potential for mutations, and mutations can lead to cancer. So the more of these toxins and oxidative stress that we have in our body, the more likely it is that we will get cancers. This is a big one that is probably not addressed enough, given that there was a Mental Health Act recently passed. But psychosocial stress is a big issue in the Bahamas and in the post-colonial world in general. I think in the world probably in general. And what happens during, evolutionarily speaking, during an acute stress insult, for example, if I'm being chased by a lion, what would happen is that my hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis, would be activated, and all of the systems that give rise to the fight or flight response would be activated via the release of stress hormones such as cortisol. Those fight or flight hormones tell my body to make energy very quickly and increase the heart rate and stuff like, and things like that enable the organism to quickly escape the threat. But what's happening in today's society now? People are under constant threat. It's like stress lives over your head constantly in many people's lives. And this is an abnormal condition for the human being. What happens under this condition is that cortisol is chronically released into the bloodstream, and the HPA axis is constantly activated, and so it's constantly telling the body, make energy, heart rate, stay high, it's this constant state of alert, hyper alertness. But the problem with this, going back to the discussion around oxidative stress and reactive oxygen species, of course, is that you're going to overload the mitochondria with all of the cortisol actually causes for greater utilization of glucose by the mitochondria. So that again leads to oxidative stress, chronic inflammation. And because now we're talking about the brain, the organ of the brain, the outcome can be anxiety, depression, heart disease, not to mention hypertension and immune impairment. Okay, my area, which I'm at home at, but also as you look more and more at the molecular level at these diseases, you start to see that there is a lot of interchange between infectious disease and chronic disease. As you look small enough, it starts to look very, very similar what's happening at the molecular level. The infectious diseases are cellular disease states induced by infection by a pathogen, such as a virus, bacteria, or a parasite, or a fungus. And as I said before, normally reactive oxygen species are generated by the immune system to kill these pathogens because they're little fireballs, again, that are able to destroy incoming, invading, parasites or pathogens. But what happens is there's a dysregulation that can be induced by and capitalized on by these pathogens. For example, with HIV is basically a chronic inflammatory disease when you look at it, because what happens is that there is an infection of the immune system cell. It's called a CD4 cell, which is a component of the immune system, and it's infected by HIV. And what HIV does is it causes for something called pyroptosis, pyro meaning fire. And inflammation also comes from the word fire. So it's no accident that we're talking about conditions that are highly fiery. And so HIV causes for CD4 cells to rupture, and this via pyroptosis, they kind of explode in the immune system. And this leads to more CD4 cells being brought in via the inflammatory response. So HIV tricks the body into bringing more CD4 cells there because that's what it wants to infect. And so it capitalizes on the inflammatory response, which is a natural part of life, and causes a chronic inflammation phenotype. On the other hand, chronic inflammation creates an overprimed immune system that can impair our adaptive immune responses to a pathogen. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, who was it who, God rest their souls, but the persons who were most struck by COVID-19, the virus is called SARS-CoV-2, but it was 95% people who had pre-existing diseases, chronic diseases like diabetes, obesity, hypertension, and so on. And the reason why they were more impacted by COVID-19 is because they had this existing background of chronic inflammation that did not allow them to mount an effective immune response to the COVID-19 virus. And it ended up in what ended up happening was a so-called cytokine storm in the lungs, which is a hyperinflammatory situation where the lungs cells are beginning to be inflamed and being killed off, leading to serious illness and, in worst cases, death. So just to summarize all of that, these pathways, lipotoxicity, glucotoxicity, genotoxicity, psychosocial stress, and infectious diseases are all ways in which oxidative stress come about, and this leads to chronic inflammation and disease depending on the organ of being targeted. For example, in the cardiovascular disease results in oxidative stress in the cardiovascular system. Cancer is caused by the genotoxicity that can arise as a result of oxidative stress, and so on and so forth. So in part 2 of this, I would like to describe why white supremacy is an issue of public health concern. White supremacy is described as the system of belief that white people constitute a superior race and should therefore dominate society, typically to the exclusion or detriment of other racial and ethnic groups. It's a key justification of colonialism and, by extension, neocolonialism. And in particular, in our case, it has been a key justification for the Mangamizi, which is a Swahili word describing the African Holocaust, which is also known as the transatlantic slave trade. So this horrible event in history, which lasted a few centuries actually, and it's still ongoing if you ask many people, but it resulted in the dehumanization and collective trauma of millions of enslaved Africans and their descendants for centuries, and again, possibly to the present day. And it's not just me saying this, the WHO, especially since the COVID pandemic, I think a lot has been brought to light. And one thing that's been brought to light is that racism has been declared a public health crisis. It's begun to be understood that racism underpins a lot of disease, particularly in persons of color, indigenous persons, and other persons who are discriminated against. So in terms, bring it to the Bahamas specifically, this is a picture from Haemonology.com describing a branding of a lady with the initials IC. So just to highlight the kind of trauma that did occur in the Bahamas, notwithstanding that there have been many who said that, we had diet slavery or slavery light. There was a lot of trauma during the slave trade in the Bahamas. And so how has this affected the people of African descent in the Bahamas? First of all, it's intergenerational trauma as a result of the Middle Passage and chattel slavery. And then following that, there was colonialism and apartheid. These are all psychosocial stressors, which I will describe in a minute, can also be passed to multiple generations. And then we had nutritional and environmental stress, which resulted as a result of the dismantling of our traditional food systems and the imposition of unhealthy Western diets. There have been socioeconomic inequalities that lead to poor nutrition and insufficient physical activity. And there's been environmental toxins introduced as a result of capitalism, colonialism, and slavery. In terms of psychosocial stress, we have financial stress, there's crime and violence. These are all things that wear away at the psychosocial milieu of the inhabitants of the Bahamas. We have childhood trauma, climate and environmental stress. I actually saw a video the other day where in Pinewood, and we had flooding in Pinewood the other day. And the lady, there was two ladies whose houses had gotten flooded out. And one of them said, "This is stressful." And the other one said, "This is depressing." I mean, these are just words that you sort of fling out, right? But that I haven't been through that. It actually is stressful. It takes its toll on the body. And it can be depressing because it's financially stressful as well. You have to build back and so on. So these are real things that are happening in the Bahamas today. And then finally, discrimination and self-hate. There still remains, even though racism is not at the fore of the Bahamian consciousness perhaps, there's still a lot of discrimination in the structural sense in the Bahamas against especially dark-skinned Bahamians, and self-hate that leads to the use of chemicals that are harmful. So there is a lot of racial disparity in disease. People of African descent in the Americas have a higher prevalence of chronic disease. We also are disproportionately impacted by other infectious diseases, such as during the COVID pandemic, which has been documented, especially in the UK and USA, where there is active discrimination against people of African descent. All of this has led to a kind of mythology around the defective African gene, that we are somehow just more, we are more susceptible to these diseases because we are, again, going back to the myth of white supremacy, less than the dominant race. But of course, it could not be that, because Africans have been around for many centuries and millennia and so on. So there's no reason why Africans would have defective genes. But that being said, in the Bahamas, if you think that racial disparity is just an American thing, it was also documented in the Bahamas in hypertension. In 1960, this paper comes from. And if you can see the shaded triangle and circle there is a higher rate of hypertension among so-called Negro residents of Nassau compared to the so-called white residents of Nassau. Although we know in the Bahamas that race is very slippery. White is very much a construct. And so it's very interesting when you're talking about self-identification, how that impacts these diseases, especially since you have Black people who look very white and white people who look very Black and so on. So it's not just us who have a disparity in hypertension. This is, in fact, an issue in the Americas and in all white countries pretty much, except for Cuba, interestingly, where you have Black people in the country. And this led to the somewhat controversial slavery hypertension hypothesis proposed by Wilson and Grimm in 1991. And they were trying to explain the fact that 45% of African Americans have hypertension versus 31% of white Americans. And they hypothesized that this was due to a genetic effect, that there was loss of fluids during the mangamese due to perspiration, vomiting, and diarrhea. And this imposed a sort of a selection pressure so that only those who survived the mangamese were more likely to have genes that supported salt retention because they were the ones who didn't die from fluid loss, right? That's the framing of the hypothesis. And then they hypothesized that this selection effect, which was initially advantageous during the harsh conditions of enslavement, actually became a disadvantage because it caused for salt retention during times like today, where you are you're not existing in a directly deprived. So you end up with a pathogenesis of hypertension arising. So this hypothesis, only one paper they ever did on this because it was so roundly attacked and rejected from all quarters. It's one of these hypotheses, amazing. People came from all of the woodworks to fight it down. And the problem is, number one, race is not a thing. It's a social construct. It's not a biological reality. You can't say just because Aborigines and in Australia and Kenyans are both dark-skinned that they're cousins. Or, that's not a real thing. They are actually two completely separate groups. And the Kenyan is probably more related to some Europeans, for example. So to look at the color of skin as a biological determinant is not scientific. It was discounted on historical bases as well, because for many reasons, I'm not going to go into the reasons, I'm not a historian, but basically because one of the suppositions was that there was no salt in West Africa, and that's why there was an existing genetic background in Africa of high salt retention, and this led to the selective effect of the Middle Passage and so on and so forth. So it's been roundly rejected. But there seems to be, I think most of us would feel, there seems to be a feeling still that there's something about slavery that did lead to disease today. And one need only look around, maybe even in one's own family, and you see how there is these diseases, these chronic diseases in our families that seem to have been passed down over generations. And if it's not genetic, if we all can agree that it's not genetic, and I think there's general scientific agreement that it's not, then what's another way that we could have gotten this? And the other way is via epigenetics. And epigenetics describes changes to the gene expression that don't change the underlying genetic code. So we have DNA, and we have a bunch of proteins that are wrapped around the DNA, kind of protecting it. And when it's time for a gene to be expressed, these proteins can unwind and allow for the protein expression material, the protein expression mechanism, to bind to the DNA and activate the gene of note. So epigenetics is all of the mechanisms that allow or disallow for the protein to be expressed by the gene. The key thing here is that it is responsive to environmental and lifestyle stimuli such as nutritional and psychosocial stress. So pertinent to our discussion. And if I go through a traumatic event, a highly traumatic event, that has an impact on my epigenome, that has an epigenetic impact on me. What can then happen is that if I was pregnant, which I'm not, thankfully, but, but if I was, I would be, and I was assaulted with this trauma or nutritional stress factor, not only would I be impacted in terms of an epigenetic effect, but also my fetus would be impacted because the fetus is right there too. The fetus feels the cortisol flooding through the body when you go through a psychosocial stressor. But not only just the fetus has germ cells. Germ cells are the sperm and the egg. So inside the fetus, the sperm and the egg are also being altered epigenetically by the stressor. And this is called intergenerational epigenetic inheritance. There's also, more controversially, a possibility of transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. This has been shown in animal models. So you can have one generation exposed to a stressor, a nutritional or traumatic stressor, and the mouse is not pregnant, but somehow is able to pass on the epigenetic modification to subsequent generations, even beyond the third generation. And so some of the best examples of this has been the Dutch famine and the Jewish Holocaust, which demonstrate the intergenerational effects of nutritional stress and trauma. You had people who were initially exposed to the stress of either famine, extreme hunger, or a psychosocial stress, like in the Holocaust. And the key thing is that the descendants of the initially exposed persons showed a predisposition to metabolic diseases like diabetes, hypertension, and obesity. So does that sound familiar? That is probably one of the ways that that we have epigenetically inherited this predisposition to disease. So in my final part, I want to propose some ways in which decolonization can be utilized and operationalized as a public health intervention. What is decolonization? I really liked this definition by the Oxford Review. It says that decolonization refers to the process of undoing colonization, where a colonized nation gains political, social, and cultural independence from the colonizer. It involves dismantling the imposed systems, structures, and ideologies of colonial powers and restoring the autonomy, identity, and heritage of indigenous or previously oppressed groups. Decolonization is not just a historical event, but an ongoing practice. And this is the part I want to highlight, that it's not just that we left Britain. It has to be that every day we are detecting the germs of rot, as Frantz Fanon says, and removing them from the land and the mind as well, aimed at addressing the lingering effects of colonization in areas such as education, governance, and cultural representation. So first of all, I want to talk about decolonizing the gut microbiome as a public health strategy for improving health in the Bahamas. And I really enjoyed making this slide because it looks like a horror. I don't know what's up with the red. When I put these three together, it looked like a horror story suddenly. But it is truly a horror story at the molecular level that is happening in the Bahamas and the wider world of African descended people when you're talking about the public health realities that we are engaged with. So when I talk about decolonizing the gut microbiome, I mean it in a figurative sense, as in we need to, ideally, if it was up to me, I would say we should ban all fast food restaurants coming into the country going forward. Um, but also, not just figuratively, but also literally, there's a difference between the gut microbiome in an obese versus a lean individual. So the gut microbiome is literally colonized in an obese individual by adverse bacteria. This is one way, again, as I said at the beginning, I'm interested in the interchange between the macro level of society and the molecular level of disease. This is one way that we can actually see a colonization of the mind resulting in a colonization of the gut. And what happens in the obese gut is that there's an increase in fatty acids, again, because of the lipotoxicity phenomenon. There is a change in the composition of the microbiome. There's different bacteria there. There's a decrease in microbiota diversity and a decrease in the richness of the microbiome. And all of this results, of course, in chronic inflammation, as we discussed. So in order to combat this, how do we combat this? I will use the words of the great African multi-genius and the father of medicine, Imhotep, who existed and lived in ancient Egypt. And he said, "Let thy food be thy medicine, and thy medicine thy food." It is very simple, but somehow it got lost along the way between Hippocrates and today. So Imhotep said that in 2023, again after the COVID pandemic, a lot of things have come to light after COVID. And this is a presidential advisory that came from the American Heart Association. And they said, food is medicine. And Imhotep rolled over in his pyramid because he was like, I said that, 10,000 years ago. So right now there's a recognition arising that food is medicine. It's such a simple statement, but it is revolutionary in terms of what it can do for health of, especially in populations such as ours that have such a high rate of chronic disease. So how is food medicine? Let's take it from the abstract to the real. Food is medicine because, in particular, plants. So I'm a vegan for many years, but I'm not going to be that Nazi vegan that tells everyone to be a vegan. But as human beings, we've evolved to consume plants. And so something very aberrant is occurring culturally in the Bahamas and the wider Caribbean in that we don't consume plants. All we're consuming a lot of meat, a lot of dairy, and a lot of grain like wheat. So the WHO actually recommends a diet that contains fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and whole grains. It recommends at least 5 portions of fruits and vegetables per day. And it's probably, I would love to know how many, what percentage of persons in the Bahamas actually consume that. And the thing is that it's so important about having a plant-based diet is that there's these compounds in plants called plant polyphenols that are literally little antioxidants. They go into the cell and they restore the redox homeostatic balance, getting rid of the reactive oxygen species that we talked so much about at the beginning, and decreasing inflammation. They also, as part of this axis, enhance immunity. So it's actually an intervention that has proven over many, many studies to lead to better human health. And it's the best intervention for our situation. Okay, the other part of decolonization that we can implement is decolonizing space. And these are what Frantz Fanon spoke to as the germs of rot in the land. So what does the space have to do with anything with human health, right? It's just a bunch of statues. But like the famous neuroscientist Brad Gage has said, change the environment, change the brain, change the behavior. And capitalizing on this connection between the external space and the human brain and the behavior of the human, neuroarchitecture in the last probably 20 years has arisen as a field of study that is dedicated to analyzing the connections between public spaces, brain, and behavior. The basis for this in terms of the animal models are that rats in a cage exhibit increased stress and aggression compared with those living in an enriched environment. So by enriching the environment, you can cause for these rats to produce more neurons in their brains. So they have their brain has more capacity. And you can also change their behavior just by changing the environment. Totally change the behavior of the rat, including reproductive behavior. So it changes, the course of that rat's lineage, in a sense. Let's talk about humans. That's rats. But in humans, there are many studies that show that if you put an urban green space in an area, you get decreased mortality, decreased heart rate, less violence, increased attention, mood, and physical activity. So therefore, changing the environment to include more green spaces actually impacts life courses in the communities in which they are put in place. Probably the best example of this, the kind of classical example of this brain behavior and public space access, is the Pruitt-Ego housing complex in the 1950s. And there's a picture of it right there. You can see there's kind of this very drab and imposing structure in which poor, particularly Black people, this is in St. Louis, Missouri, people of color, were placed. And you can see that there was an obvious structural segregation between this housing complex and the surrounding environment. And what resulted was the housing complex became a site of criminality and measured poor health. So this is kind of the example it's always used, especially in neuroarchitecture, to show that structural reinforcement of racial and economic segregation can lead to behavioral aberration and health issues. My question in this regard is whether in the Bahamas, if we start to remove imperial formations, can we impact public health? And I would hypothesize that we can. We have in the Bahamas many imperial formations still around. We have discriminatory boundaries, such as over the hill, which once segregated Black from white, poor from rich. Likewise, the Collins Wall, which is now sort of falling to decay, but it still is a formation that actually draws a line between people and communities. And something more modern, the gentrification of the coast. How stressful is it when you can't see the ocean? You're on a little small island. And I know some people who haven't seen the ocean in a long time from living in the inner city. So these are some of the formations that can cause this segregation. The other thing is the colonial edifices, which is my favorite topic, if you know me. Because they consolidate principles of white supremacy. Otherwise, why is Columbus up there? Why is Queen Elizabeth in front of the Parliament when she died a long time ago and she was the one who brought our ancestors here? There's something very irrational even about the whole thing. At the end of the day, public spaces should engender a sense of belongingness according to neuroarchitecture and connectedness, which are not conveyed by these imperial lords in our most vaunted public spaces. And finally, decolonizing the mind, very key aspect of operationalizing decolonization. I put this this logo up, the UB logo, which is a Sankofa flamingo. So I love the UB logo. It's very beautiful because it just shows you how decolonization is something that is ongoing. And I salute the Bahamian Academy for taking that process on. So Sankofa is an Akan word from Ghana, translated to is not to go back for what you forgot. And what it means really is look back to see forward. There's a few ways in which one can operationalize Sankofa through African-centered education, which has been shown to have positive impacts on health of African-descended people. We can return to the nutrient-dense ancestral foods that our ancestors lived off of prior to this commonality of chronic disease that we see in the modern day. We can talk about reframing beauty standards so that no longer are people using bleaching creams and hair texturizing chemicals, which are significant sources of environmental toxicity. Then we can talk about modernizing traditional knowledge and traditional medicine. These are all things that can be done at the individual level, but more importantly at the systemic policy and governmental level to ensure that the spatial, cultural, and psychological milieu is conducive to good human health in the Bahamas. Ultimately, I personally believe in an Ubuntu approach to public health. Ubuntu is a Zulu word meaning I am because we are. So we have to work together across these imperial formations and other boundaries to create a holistic health paradigm in the Bahamas. So in closing, the biomedical case for decolonization, it provides a conceptual framework for the research and design of public health interventions that address the root causes upstream of diseases. And it highlights that white supremacy and its structures in a post-colonial nation like the Bahamas are community-level issues requiring systemic and policy change rather than focusing on individual behaviors. My argument is, in totem, that the future of a purpose-built public health paradigm in a post-colonial setting like the Bahamas must necessarily contend with decolonization as an aspect of public health, especially because there's a cost to it. We have national health insurance in which chronic diseases are being facilitated. And so I think at the end of the day, just through a logical lens and a lens of rationalism, we will have to address these issues that linger in the background. And make sure you remember I said that. Okay, so I just want to summarize with my kind of structural model by which I believe that public health governance can be utilized to systematize and operationalize decolonization using a research-based approach for the detection, treatment, and prevention of disease. So I talked about how white supremacy leads to, or not leads to, but how the children of white supremacy are colonialism and neocolonialism. These lead to psychosocial stress, lipotoxicity, glucotoxicity, genotoxicity, environmental toxicity, and make worse the risk for infectious disease. It also, in the history of our country and others like us, has caused historical trauma that we know can be intergenerationally and possibly transgenerationally inherited across at least 3 generations and probably more. And this is also in the context of continuing the manga music continues. So the trauma, the assaults of these toxins and stressors continue to the present day. So every generation is possible that epigenetic modifications can be occurring and passed down to the following 3 generations at least. Now these stressors, they all lead to our good friend or bad enemy, more like oxidative stress, which has this kind of relationship with chronic inflammation where they feed back onto each other. And this can result in diseases such as depression when it happens in the brain, obesity when it happens in the fat cells due to lipotoxicity, diabetes when it's in the pancreas, hypertension in the kidneys and blood vasculature, cancer when you're talking about genotoxic threat, and an increased infection risk. And these feed back onto the chronic inflammation and oxidative stress. What I'm saying is that if we put decolonization in this mix, what I proposed is decolonizing space, decolonizing the gut microbiome, and decolonizing the mind via the mechanisms, the operationalized mechanisms of neuroarchitecture, food as medicine, or Sankofa. I'm proposing that we can measurably block or decrease these pathways to disease, the stress, the fat, the sugar, and so on. And so these can be measured at both the clinical level, which is the level of the individual, as well as measuring disease at the population level. So what we can do as public health governors is we can implement policies that look to decrease disease and measure whether disease is being decreased. And this is the way that we can sustainably and measurably in an evidence-based way decolonize the Bahamas for the purpose of public health. So I would like to close with the words of our Delhi departed elder, Asada Shakur, who just died the other day. And she said that we need to be weapons of mass construction, weapons of mass love. It's not just enough to change the system, we need to change ourselves. And I think this is very much a part of the decolonization of the Bahamas towards better health for our people. So thank you very much for listening, and I will be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Indira. Just wanted to know quickly, I stepped up for a second, I don't know if I missed it, but in terms of the CARICOM 10-point reparations list, health is one of those line items. Do you know if they have a presentation like this that they could possibly videotape, put on their websites, disseminate? Because I think when we see health as a basis for reparations, most times people think, what exactly in the heck are you talking about? So you just broke it down for us. So as it relates to reparations and that movement, can you see somehow finding out if they do have a presentation like this? Because public awareness around reparations in the Bahamas is dismal.
I thank you for mentioning reparations because as a member of the reparations committee, there's a few of us today on the panel that are in the reparations committee, and this is really what got me interested in this aspect of health, looking at the impact of colonial systems and slavery on modern Bahamian health. So to be honest with you, I would say that this is kind of a burgeoning field. Epigenetics, for example, is a relatively recent area of study, I'd say like in the last 30 years or so. And connecting race and racism and white supremacy to health is also a relatively recent phenomenon. So there isn't much, they can have my presentation, but there isn't much that is connecting these dots all the way through in terms of how not just historical trauma, but also modern trauma is leading to poor health. In especially, so in America, that's where a lot of the studies have been done, and probably the most work. Talking about like discrimination, for example, perceived discrimination, I should say, actually leads to oxidative stress, measurable oxidative stress, and chronic inflammation in African Americans. So there's more study in America, but as far as in the Bahamas or in anywhere that's looking, the former colonies, I would say, looking at colonialism rather than discrimination per se, there isn't much on that. So I think as time goes by, it will definitely become a really important part of the 10-point reparations plan, because it's the thing that people can really touch and feel and hear. And most people, it's instinctively feel like slavery has something to do with modern health and disease. It's just an instinctive feeling, and it's probably correct via an epigenetic mechanism.
Hi, great presentation. In the presentation, you said that the mind colonizes the gut. Just a small reference. I'm sure not the fullness of it, but I wanted to point out that the gut actually colonizes the mind.
True.
Right, like the gut controls what goes on out here. So I join in you in this. Maybe we need to ban fast food, run as a response to white supremacist agendas, because the response to people is, it's your thinking is the problem. That you, the individual, are the problem because of how you're thinking, and how what you're thinking informs your choices, right? But the truth is, what is in your gut informs your thinking and your choices, right? It's bio-warfare, and should be approached in that way.
Go ahead.
So sorry, just to respond to that, I just recently stopped eating sugar, for example, just on a personal level, and I have seen such a shift in terms of my cravings. And there have been a number of studies that have shown that when you stop eating sugar or fats, you actually change the gut microbiome, the bacteria in the gut. And the reason why that's significant in terms of what you say, Erin, is that those bacteria in the gut can actually trick the brain into craving things that feed them. So when I was eating a lot of sugar, my gut bacteria, they love sugar. So they used to be like, Indira, go to Dunkin' Donuts. Used to whisper in my ear. But now, since I stopped eating sugar, I don't have those cravings. I have different bacteria in my gut now that want a banana or whatever. They still want sugar, but they don't want that much sugar, a high concentration.
Food health advocates are now pointing out that there was this whole campaign that salt is bad for you, right? That salt is leading to the heart conditions. That's an intentional lie. It's the sugar that's doing all of those things, and then including stressing systems.
And the fat.
Thank you for your presentation. I always love when we ride this line between science and the perspective, right? Obviously. So for me, when you talk about decolonizing spaces and decolonizing the gut, one of the things that I've been developing over the years is I now have the largest farm in the Bahamas, because I plant trees in other people's yards all over the country. And so what is your view on improving spaces in the Bahamas? For example, we don't have edible fruit trees on this campus
We do.
for the most part. I mean,
Thompson Shropshire prune tighten up
Yeah.
the floods.
yeah, there's some obscure ones, and then also in other government properties, schools and stuff like that. Do you know of a link between childhood education on eating wild fruits or native fruits and what that does to you as you grow older?
I think that's a great question, and there's been a lot of studies that have shown that by planting trees, by creating more greenery, especially in a concrete jungle, you can really impact the space and the surrounding area. As far as childhood, the impact on children, there's definitely a lot to be said for, eating any plants in general, going back to having a plant-based diet and having, accessibility to these plants, because we have a lot of food deserts in the Bahamas and, in other places, in other urban environments. So definitely, I think interaction with nature as well obviously has a positive impact. So that is the kind of thing that I would love to have as a public health intervention and measure the effect. You know, if we have children and in a neighborhood and plant native trees there, and then you can see we could work together. And so, you know, and then we're taking blood samples at intervals over the life course of this child, and also doing like psychometric testing and so on or whatever to look at whether those types of interventions are actually going to shift. And my based on the evidence from elsewhere, I would definitely say that that would have a positive impact, would be anticipated to have a lifelong positive impact.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question about the relationship between the gut microbiome and epigenetics. Do you think that an altered, less diverse gut microbiome, like found in an obese person, for example, may have an epigenetics effect on the gut microbiome of the offspring and future generation? Is there research on that? What is your opinion on that?
Absolutely, excellent question. There is a lot of evidence that an obesogenic gut, which, as we discussed, then leads to oxidative stress and inflammation, can have an epigenetic impact on the developing child in the womb of an obese mother. So one of the things that that happens, for example, is premature birth in obese women. You can also get some other issues, you know, with the child, and this can potentially, I would think that this can pass on at least 2-3 generations going forward.
I want to ask something. Do you think that one of the reasons why we have found it so difficult to properly, I'm going to put a judgment on it, is that, I mean, none of us are from here, and what I've learned about plants in the Bahamas is that most of the things that we eat, even the things we adorn ourselves with, are plants that were imported. You know, like even something that we think is ours, like hog plants, they didn't originate here. They don't. If you plant the seeds, they don't grow. They are only they can only be biologically reproduced. And I just wonder what kind of effect did it have on us? And I'm talking about both populations, the white and the black population, that we just didn't know. You know, when I live in Europe, and everybody knows all the plants, and they have like names that everybody knows in every island. But if you pass in the bush and you say, "What's that there, man?" Nobody knows.
Yeah, that's a powerful point, not only just for fruit, but also for traditional medicine. So, you know, if you look in the bush right now, I have a Haitian friend who came over to my house, and he was able to identify all kind of medicines that I had. I was just about to cut all of it. All kind of different medicines that I had in the bush. And of course, this is passed down from parent to child. And it's a source of great knowledge. And these knowledge passageways are being destroyed in the Bahamas, or they cease to exist. So just from that perspective alone, from the knowledge perspective of what is in your environment for your use for food and medicine, whether imported or not, because a lot of things have also come, you know, sort of drifted on the ocean, like mangrove, Coconuts drifted from Asia, so we've had a lot of things that came possibly to us. Sorry?
Okra's with us.
Okra, ackee, we brought with us. So we brought some stuff with us, and some things also came, possibly some things came actively, like jujube is a Chinese fruit, and so on, the juju. But there's an anthropologist, very famous anthropologist, Fatima Jackson, who has looked, to your point, she's looked at African plants, in particular cassava. And some cassava is the one I recommend. I remember, but I think there were a couple others. But she's identified a link between consumption of cassava and other indigenous African plants and immunity in African people. So, different ethnicities have different HLA groups, for example, in their immune system. So her argument is that there is an African diet that we should follow if we want optimum immunity. And that is definitely something I think that needs to be explored in our setting, because as you said, we're not from here. Well, I mean, in parts, yeah. But also I've recently realized that we have, not recently realized, but I've recently acknowledged that we also have a lot of Native American blood. So, we are in a sense from here, a lot of us, most of us, but most of our bloodstream as African descended people does come from Africa. So assessing the extent to which Dr. Jackson's hypothesis would apply to us in terms of our admixture would be interesting. I think it probably would, because again, even in Africa, no one is one thing. It's also a mixture in Africa. There have been many movements from Arab nations into Africa, from other parts of the world, So they're also an admixture. But it's a very interesting field of study, I think, looking at which plants are most advantageous for our people, given our genetic background.
First of all, Indira, I want to thank you for what I consider to be a very thought-provoking, scholarly presentation.
Thank you.
It really blew my mind, really, all of the things that you said. I'm going to make a quick comment and then a question. I think one of the areas that your work is really meaningful and powerful is attacking a general narrative about slavery in the Bahamas being better than anywhere else. There's this sort of behaving exceptionalist discourse that slavery was better in the Bahamas. A lot of that is based on work done by Michael Creighton in the 80s, where he did a study called Panglossian versus Hobbesian. It was published in the William and Mary Quarterly, and it looked at the Worthy Parks plantation in Jamaica versus the 4 plantations that Lord John Wold owned in Exuma. And in it, he's arguing that enslaved persons in the Bahamas are healthier, they had a higher fertility rate, they lived in nucleated families, they had a better diet, versus those working in the gang system on Worthy Parks plantation in Jamaica, which had much higher mortality rate, fertility rate was much lower. He attributed it to the gang system. But your work turns that on its head in a way, because we used to argue, well, conditions were better in the Bahamas. But what I'm arguing, what I'm hearing from you is state terror at the hands of the oligarchs and also merchant class, the enslavers, is a stress factor, along with the slave codes, along with a prevailing racial ideology that created environmental conditions that we have ignored. The psychosocial conditions impacted enslaved persons in the Bahamas in a profound way, which you have pointed out is transgenerational. So this challenges that whole narrative about slavery being better in the Bahamas. It questions the efficacy of those who argue along that vein when we see the product of that, hundreds of years later, because that has not gone away. And I think the other beauty in your argument is it takes the reparatory case from the period of enslavement right to the present. We see an unbroken chain of deliberate efforts to colonize our mind and our bodies in a way that having a consequential impact on our lives, all right, or on our death. So the last thing, and this is the question, I suppose, and I want to say one last thing, comment. Race in space is powerful, over the hill versus who lives on top of the hill, right? Counterpoint to each other, right? And then Collins Wall, who's on one side and who's on the other side. So we can't negate the fact that race in space is still being played out while we speak. Green space, garden space, park space, a national heroes park with real Bahamian heroes, not Queen Victoria and Columbus. That still needs to be addressed. Why is it that we've lagged behind all of our comrades in the Caribbean, whether it be Jamaica or Cuba, as it relates to erecting a national heroes park? My question though, I think what would be good is to look at, for example, a sample size in your theory of methods to looking at, say, a Jamaica or Barbados or other slave states where we have the same sort of pattern of dietary neglect and the matters that you refer to, and look at how they, just Creighton used a particular method in trying to advance his case. I'm saying maybe we could use a similar, your method, to apply it to a comparative study of other territories in the region. And then I'm also interested in looking at it from a gender perspective, because there's scholarship like Jennifer Morgan, and there's also even Barbara Bush in the earlier point in Jamaica, that looked at gendered resistance from a female perspective. And I'm wondering if the effects that women that are enslaved, that double burden that they describe, is worth exploring through the what's the word you use? The
epigenetic? Okay.
Yeah, perspective. Yes, because that I think would help us appreciate the nuance of how these things impacted enslaved persons and their progenitors.
Yeah, that's I think your final 2 points. When you're talking about looking comparatively at other, first of all, thank you for your comments, because I always appreciate, I'm always going to Dr. Curry for historical knowledge, so because it feeds so much into what I want to say. And yeah, so to your point about comparative analysis of other settings, in that paper that I posted about the hypertension prevalence in Black versus white Nassau residents, there is actually a comparative sub-study looking at St. Kitts. And the reason why they're looking at St. Kitts is because St. Kitts doesn't have as much high salt in their water supply. So this was one of the major things that they were trying to say in that study. They were trying to hint that it's a genetic thing, that Black people are just more, predisposed to hypertension, rather than it being this constant barrage of psychosocial discriminatory stress and poor nutrition. But what they did show, even looking through that lens, is that St. Kitts has high hypertension as well in Black people versus white people. So despite the salt not being as much as in the Bahamas. So I think it underscores your point that there is something about the experience of the state violence and terror of enslavement, not just enslavement, even taking it broader, discrimination, being submitted to being at the bottom of a hierarchy. All of these have like a biological effect, not just in humans, but in chimps, in mice, and in pretty much the higher mammals respond to hierarchical stress and also captivity stress, which is another thing. So I think that is definitely a great point. And I think the second point that you made about gendered, that's something I was actually thinking about, because there seems to be something about racial discrimination that is different in terms of its biological manifestation versus gender discrimination. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's a sociological answer, because yeah, maybe women are not dehumanized in the same way because of womanness. Although, I mean, it does happen, obviously, but the experience of being treated like an animal, you know, during slavery and all of that, I think has had a particularly profound impact. But women, that being said, are still the bearers of the future generations. So, and they also have been the ones who often were on the receiving end of rape as well, which is a unique stressor that the men would have gone through a lot less, hopefully. So I think it's definitely worth studying. To what extent? That's something I was actually thinking about while writing this, studying whether there is a doubling effect of being woman and black. On that.
One or two more for me and break for lunch. Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. So my question is more about genetics and identity. You mentioned that someone from, I guess, the continent, because we're using like the term black and African and Bahamian, and so you mentioned that someone, I think it was like an Aboriginal or in Europe may not be, maybe closer genetically speaking to someone that's dark skinned, so color isn't a clear indicator of our connection. And so that raises a big question in my mind, right? Because if we can't connect ourselves to each other, then the conversation kind of falls apart, because especially in the Bahamas, when everyone, conversations I've had, a lot of dark persons want to feel closer to maybe a European ancestry or something else, and then I can't say anything to them if based on what you said, and so that's it. So that's one question. And second question, quickly, thank you, sorry, is so no more questions.
Okay, thank you for your question. I think that's an excellent question. If we go back historically, I'm not a historian, but if we go back to before the transatlantic slave trade, nobody in Africa was saying I'm black. They were saying I'm Igbo, I'm Yoruba, I'm Fulani. You know, there was tribe, there was ethnic identity. What the Mangamizi did was it put everybody together. Y'all just black now, and you come on the boat because we're gonna go work some plantations because you're black. So the slave trade actually had, and white supremacy had an imperative to ensure that all the ethnicity was faded out, and none of us, or very few of us today, can tell you what ethnicity we are. We can only say I'm Bahamian and black, but that's not even a descriptive genetically of who we are. What would be descriptive is for me to be able to say, maybe we're from Cameroon, from X, Y, Z. So white supremacy is the structure that designated blackness. Now, what it did with blackness then, because we had Roman emperors who were black before then. There was no racism, or there wasn't the racism as we know it today. But white supremacy created a structure where now you're black, you're the bottom of the hierarchy, and you're gonna go work the fields, and that's the reason why you're gonna go work the fields, because you're black, you're subhuman, and so on and so forth. Now, out of that, what came was stuff like the one-drop theory. You got people who look white. I mean, in the Bahamas, they look very white, but they have African lineage, and they may identify as either white or black. Who knows? In the Bahamas, it's all fluid. It's because race is not a thing. You can identify as anything, as Rachel Dolezal showed. Now, that being said, when white supremacy designated black, there became a political imperative for black people to identify as black in order to fight the white supremacy. So I am not, in my thinking, I'm not trying to decentralize political blackness. I think it has to be measured against the genetic reality, which is that we come from, there are many different ethnicities that have dark skin, and they're not necessarily interrelated. But what the political philosophy of blackness allows is exactly for what you just described. It allows for, it turns it on its head. It says, okay, yeah, all us black, then black. And then we're gonna fight this together, notwithstanding our ethnic differences. And that is the only way in my mind, because even whiteness is not a thing. You know, when you go to Europe, you find all kinds of different white people. There's not just British and German, which is the colonizer. There's also Lithuanian, people, Polish, people who have nothing to do with colonialism, the Slavic peoples and so on, who you may or may not call white. And yes, so Africa is the most diverse continent in the world. It's where all humanity comes from. And I think that the Pan-African, I consider myself a Pan-Africanist because it's strategic in a white supremacy reality. But I think it also has to be balanced against diversity and embracing our diversity, because that is something that is also an instrument against white supremacy. It also says that we are many different things, but we come together in this political directorate.
Final question.
That was a wonderful presentation,
Thank you.
Dr. Martin. But as you were speaking, I was thinking, you know, what you were laying out was a basis for a political movement in the country. No, seriously, it's so broad and holistic. It can embrace the basis of a movement, and so I'm going to probe your politics in terms of where is this thinking situated in terms of political action and praxis. And you know, if we wanted to think about a specific question coming out of that, it would be, you know, where is the resistance to McDonald's, to Wendy's, to Popeyes? Where is it? And I want you to speak to that political action question, please.
That's why the first slide of my presentation was dedicated to the national heroes, to Chevron-Des Smith, I think his name is, who was AKA Michael the Archangel, who did away with all of the talking that was happening about decolonizing the space in front of Government House, which had the Columbus statue. He was like, he just went and did it. And that's why I think, so obviously, in case people may not know, I'm sure you all know, but he chopped off the leg of Columbus, which allowed for the politicians to do what they needed to do anyway and what they wanted to do, because no one with any sense of nation building thought that the Columbus statue should be sitting in front of our nation's port. As someone who committed genocide against the original people of these lands. So Michael the Archangel, he is someone who I really look up to because he did what I did not have the courage to do, which was to take down that statue. I think one thing that needs to happen with him is that he needs to have his record expunged, because he did that on behalf of a nation, basically did that on behalf of the future. And he knew what he was doing. They say he's a crazy person, but he had a bulletproof vest on, because he knew that in this sort of sick reality that we live in, the police might shoot him for desecrating a statue, which is just stone. But because of what this statue means to the fabric of this neo-colonial environment that we exist in, they might have shot him. So he knew that, and it was a political action. Going further, I agree with you totally that there needs to be, so I'm going to stay in my lane in terms of public health. Yeah. So public health needs to be politically active. But public health in a decolonized, post-colonial setting like the Bahamas needs to ensure that those fast food restaurants are banned.
Can I just jump in before we go? I want to say three things that are political, that have to do with public health, that speak to not that we should not look at slavery and the need for reparations, but the responsibility of black governments in 50 years. That when I was in public school, the lunch that available was O. Henry, barbecue corn chip, and Coca-Cola. So we don't teach our children how to eat. We run those schools, right? So we are training our people to poison themselves when we have an opportunity to teach them how to eat as well as how to think. And we create regulations around how subdivisions are created, and we let them cut down every single tree in these communities, right? So we create a public health problem when we put people in rat traps that we call so-and-so estates, right? And then we also have the problem of the clinicians who become wealthy and the insurance companies who make money because we are obese and we are sick, but I do not remember in my 56 years ever seeing a national campaign in this country around weight loss, fitness, being active, living a certain type of life, preventative health. And I've seen safe sex, I've seen, say no to drugs, but where are we actually mobilizing around being fit and healthy and moving it? We aren't even trying. The only thing I can remember is the former minister who wanted to put a higher price on corned beef, and we screamed the man down, and the government backed off. Right? So what we have the power to do in how we plan and how we organize and how we govern and how we use our tax dollars, we refuse to do. That is deeply problematic, and that is us as a black nation doing that to ourselves. And so, yeah. Feel free to respond.
No, sorry, I was just going to say that there's been from CARICOM and Caribbean Public Health Agency and the Ministry of Health has been doing some campaigns. But to me, so they had the Caribbean plate, something like the Caribbean Healthy Plate Day. And someone commented under the flyer, and said, "Show us a healthy plate." So, I think that there's some stuff happening from the Ministry of Health. I know that they have a healthy lifestyles initiative and so on, but it has to be real life and go on the ground in the communities. And it needs a culture shift. You have to show people how this looks, because if you say, here's some eggplant and some this and that, and different fruit and vegetables, they will rot if people don't know how to prepare them. If people just are used to a particular cultural way of eating. Another thing I would add to what you said is, if you look at the people, again, no disrespect, but a lot of people who are implementing health have their own health issues. Yeah, so that's a part of it as well.
Right, so we could ban fast food, we teach people. So, it's there, but you don't have to eat it. Right? So, listen, let's give Dr. Martin a hand.
Thank you.
For a fantastic presentation. And thank you so very much.
Thank you.